is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Following the 2020 U.S. presidential election, America has had to face a growing number of challenges to its democratic institutions. From allegations of voter fraud to uncertainty over when President Trump will concede, the world is watching to see how strong America's democracy truly is. The November 3rd election saw the highest voter turnout since 1990. Nearly 67% of registered voters turned up to make their voices heard. Joe Biden has been declared by several media organizations as the winner of the election, with world leaders reaching out to congratulate him. But President Trump has once again bucked tradition, refusing to concede. Despite this fracture, Joe Biden has vowed to unify the country and restore the soul of America. Democracies around the world are now watching to see if he will be able to do just that. This week on Talk Africa, we will discuss the implications of this pivotal U.S. presidential election for Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, let's bring in our guests now, and joining us via Zoom from Washington, D.C. is Emira Woods. She's an associate fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. In Beijing is Dr. John Gong, professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. And from Johannesburg, we have J. Brooks Spector, an international relations expert and former U.S. diplomat. In Cairo, Ambassador Ahmed Haggag, Secretary General of the African Society. Thank you all for joining us in this discussion. I want to get your view first, all of you, about the 2020 U.S. election, because the U.S. election has definitely captured the global eye, with the largest voter turnout in 100 years, estimated at about 66% of eligible voters casting their ballots, which translates to about 159 million Americans voting in this election. First, Brooks, let me start off with you. What do you make of the presidential election looking in from the outside?
The turnout was high in part because it was a deeply divided society over who should in fact become president or be reelected. As a result, there was lots of interest in voting, but one of the major new factors, something that hadn't happened before at this level, was the number of people who voted either by advance voting or by mail. Well over 100 million of the votes counted came that way, and that was partly a function of the fear of infection or contagion from the COVID virus. But what it did do, it gave some fuel to the arguments by some that there were irregularities in the election, arguments that we're still seeing being played out now by President Trump and his associates, although they're not likely to succeed in any of the courts that they have taken these complaints to. They continue to make the charges. What it also says is that I think many Americans, perhaps a majority of Americans, were really very tired of not the excitement of the Trump administration, but the chaos of it, the constant surprises, often unpleasant ones. And as a result, they voted significantly for Joe Biden, who is predictable and who made a great point during his campaign of being empathetic, having a quality of empathy, understanding people's pain as a result of the virus, as a result of the consequent economic failures. And that captured the attention of people in a significant way. At this point, somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 million more people voted for him than voted for Donald Trump. Right.
Emira Woods, you're watching this from inside the U.S. You have participated in the process. What is the feeling inside the U.S. regarding the goings-on with the electoral process?
It feels like shock and awe, to be quite honest, right? I think there was a collective holding of the breath throughout this whole electoral season, a concern that the country was very much split, a concern which bore out at the polls, and really a concern that the results of the election would not be respected, which is also to some extent bearing fruit. But I think what we saw was that, in fact, this has been perhaps the most consequential election of the 21st century for the United States. It is incredible to see and to underscore that the results of this election show that is, in fact, what was expected was a blue wave, but it's a black and brown wave. It was Black and brown people that made the difference. Black, brown, and indigenous people in this country made the difference in this election. So what you see, yes, it's 71 million people voting for Trump, 75 million people voting for Biden. But if you delve deeper, that difference, the significance, it's reflecting the changing demographics of this country. It is a changing demographics that will continue in this 21st century. And I think you will continue to see the power of that changing demographics also reflected in a push towards a much more progressive agenda. Let's remember, it is young people, Black, brown, and indigenous people that are fighting for multilateralism, that are fighting for issues around protecting the planet, protecting people, particularly in the midst of this global pandemic. So that demographic that will be key, not only in this election result, but in what's to come in this 21st century for the United States.
Ambassador Hagag, I want to get your thoughts as well, watching, from the Middle East, watching from Egypt, with what has been happening in the Middle East. What is your take on the electoral process?
I served my country for a long time, many years in the United States, and I observed many elections, although each election was a unique in itself. But this election was the most unique one in the history of the United States. It was very much polarizing among the American people, and there is a lot of accusation, counter accusations, and if we look about it in Africa, Africa was also divided in their sympathies or choice for either one of the contenders. One part of it was wishing that Trump will have a second term, and another one was considering Trump did nothing in Africa for the United States, and they were wishing that Biden will take over. And I think now there is a sigh of relief that Biden has been almost elected, if you can wish that. And they look forward to the new administration to be much more involved in African affairs.
Dr. Gong, let me get your thoughts here, because it does seem that there was a lot at stake in this election in the United States. We have seen in the U.S. over the last 4 years a lot of discussion domestically and internationally about what is happening in the United States. Dr. John Gong, what do you think were some of the issues that made it pertinent for people from both sides of the divide to vote with such a passion in this election?
Well, President Trump has its base. He has a very strong base. He has, 70 million people voted for him. And for a long time, he has been pretty much preaching and speaking to his base. But this country, United States is very divided, even before this pandemic. But getting to January, February, when this pandemic started to hit the United States, President Trump's fate has just gone downhill. And he has been, issuing statements one day after another from that podium in the White House. In my opinion, that's a total self-destruction process. This election is mostly about delivering a verdict on his handling of the pandemic. And that was a total fiasco, right? 250,000 people have died. He has done nothing. He has disinformed people. He has peddled lies. He's practiced medicine without license. All these things ultimately contribute to his collapse. And of course, the last act of his strategy is just trying to mess up with the Constitution. I think he deliberately came up with this strategy to deny mailing ballots and ask his supporters to vote on November 3rd. And this is a total tragic. I think total tragic that this strategy doesn't work out, and it shouldn't have worked out, in my opinion.
Emira Woods, is that the thinking inside the United States, though, that the handling of the Trump administration on the pandemic caused a major fallout here?
Well, without a doubt, the pandemic, especially as these numbers are surging throughout the country, it is front and center on people's minds. And the total collapse of a health system, particularly when the pandemic is impacting disproportionately Black and brown people. I think what you see was that it felt almost as a reinforcement of racist policies in this administration, this Trump administration, reflected in total disregard for people's lives. So I think there was a concern about COVID, without a doubt. Also, really a concern about just the way in which this government, the Trump administration, has disregarded democracy, undermining the vote. Basic issues, like disallowing postal service to do mail-in votes, discouraging people from voting, voter suppression, outright voter suppression, closing polls, particularly in Black and brown communities. There was total disregard for democracy. And so it felt like democracy was on the ballot and people were voting to protect it, as well as voting to protect engagement with the rest of the world, whether it's on the World Health Organization, making sure that the U.S. is a part of the World Health Organization during a global pandemic, or things like the Paris Climate Agreement. So it's re-engaging the U.S. with the world, stopping the U.S. from really being a laughingstock of the world, but really truly ending this push towards emboldening white supremacy in this country.
We're going to look at what how the international community, or how the U.S. will re-engage with the international community in just a minute. But first, I want to get your thoughts, Brooke Spector, because Emira has mentioned an issue about about democracy and about the U.S. Having long been viewed as a beacon of democracy. How does the current situation, though, sit or impact the global image of democracy?
Well, I think it's quite clear that the image, and perhaps the reality of it as well, took something of a beating over the last couple of years, and Donald Trump was certainly no exemplar to serve as the illumination for the spread of democratic practice. But one of the things that I do note is that in a number of articles that were written for Joe Biden or written by him, he made it quite clear leading up to the election that the American international presence must reflect the broader, deeper enrichment of democratic practice within the country if it is to speak knowledgeably, effectively, and appropriately abroad. So from my perspective, sitting here in Africa and watching this and reading it, I think there is some hope that a Joe Biden presidency will be able to deliver on that to some degree. But the 4-year run of the Trump administration has put a fair amount of tarnish on that image, and it's going to take some effort and some ingenuity and a lot of energy to turn that around. I know that's a mixed metaphor, but you know what I mean. One of the things that has to happen is that the country has to show, in spite of its presumably deeply divided self, it has to begin to show some sense of agreement and understanding on more basic values. That becomes harder when you have people claiming that the election was a fraud, whether they're international people claiming it or whether it's somebody within the Trump camp claiming it. But the one thing I will say is that Joe Biden has served a heck of a long time in national government positions, And I think he has a pretty good understanding of how much work this is going to be.
All right, on that note, let's take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue the conversation on the 2020 U.S. election and the future of democracy. Stay with us.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue our discussion. Still joining me via Zoom from Washington, D.C. is Emira Woods. Dr. John Gong is joining us from Beijing. Brooks Spencer is joining us from Johannesburg. And also with us from Cairo is Ambassador Hagag. Well, let's go now to Brooks Spector. I want to get your thoughts here because America has over the years lectured Africa on issues of democratic governance, on transparent and fair electoral processes. Going forward, though, do you think America still has the moral ground to lecture Africa on its electoral processes?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, yes, because if nothing else, the election was nasty, the election was unpleasant. The Trump administration and its campaign and a good chunk of the Republican Party failed to adhere to the standard practice. But in the end, the people's will appears to have been done, and the votes have been counted fairly and accurately and honestly, and nobody stole ballots, and there was no wholesale burning of the ballot papers. There was no theft in that regard. What it means is, though, that the quality of the rhetoric around the election, the quality of the kinds of charges that people make about the way this game is played has done some significant reputational damage. In the end, the process is peaceful, we hope. The Army has not been called out to restore order, as has happened in any number of other places. There are not guards every 30 meters along the street for this kind of thing, and there isn't weeks of rioting that follows an election. So I think we can also overplay the damage as well as note it carefully and dissect it and analyze it. I am guardedly optimistic as a result that the Biden administration, as it comes into power, will be able to make a good show of saying, this is how we do it, this is how we do it right, and we hope you agree. That's a little different than saying, do it or else. But I think that's going to have to be the standard that the Biden administration will have to use, will look forward to using, and will try to make an appropriate thing.
Emira Woods, the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives is still quite split. How much change can realistically take place, though?
Well, I think we're waiting until January to see the control of the Senate. But the reality is that it will be, it will be very tight in terms of the outcome of the upcoming recounts and revotes. So I think what we have to see is that, both Democrats and Republicans have had, controversial Africa relations. I think what we need is an administration and a Congress that is focused on regaining a commitment to multilateralism, particularly in the midst of this global health pandemic. So, what that means is immediately rejoining the World Health Organization, and I'm reasonably confident that will happen after January. And it also means making sure that vaccines are, when they are available and proven safe and all of that, are made readily available to everyone. that there is access to the technology to be produced in Africa. These will be the steps that show a true multilateralism, that will be putting the needs of the globe first, quite different than what we've had over the last 4 years. Being able to lift up the importance of a continent with 55 nations and with over 1.5 billion people that's on the rise. How do we say that the U.S. must have a greater prioritization of Africa's interests in foreign policy? I think this is the opportunity in the new administration.
Ambassador Hagag, you talked about this earlier on, and you talked about what Africa's expectations would be with an incoming president in the United States. Give us your thoughts here.
I think I've noticed that there is no African American summit that has been held in the last few years, although it was held during the last 10 years. So Africa should push for the resumption of this tradition. They should sell themselves to the public opinion in the United States. They should now start talking to the new administration, not to wait for the inauguration in January. And we should make our presence in Africa as a united one. We hope now we are going to have an African free trade zone, so we have to hope to have a united front vis-a-vis the United States. Of course, bilateral relations are very important, but we have to harmonize our relations with the United States as we do regularly with Europe, the European Union.
Brooke Spector, we have already seen some steps being taken or being proposed, though, with the President-elect Joe Biden in trying to mend fences and America's relationship with the international community, including reversing the controversial America First agenda, returning to the Paris climate change agreement, and restoring U.S. membership, or saying that he would restore the U.S. membership in the World Health Organization. How hard is this going to be, though? Those steps of re-energizing America again, how hard is that going to be?
Well, look, first let me stake out one important thing. Until January 20th, he's not yet the president. And so everything he says is aspirational as opposed to actual activity. But it is also clear that he said that within the beginning moments of his presidency, the country will return to the Paris Climate Accord. They will take efforts to return to the six-power Iran nuclear deal, that they will return to the World Health Organization. Now, those three steps are symbolic, they're important, and they can be done without the agreement of Congress, or let alone the Senate, because they are not treaties in the formal sense of the word for the United States. They were agreements that the president, by virtue of executive power, could take. It's not hard to reverse the decisions. In fact, it's fairly straightforward. If there are political costs to it, well, then that would be a different question. But that doesn't seem to be the kind of thing that would have harsh political repercussions at the beginning of a term of office. As far as building a better relationship with the continent, whether it is an Africa-U.S. summit, whether it is negotiations on free trade along the lines of something that I was mentioning, those are the kinds of things that do not bear fruit immediately. They create climates for things that can and will happen down the road. What you should not look forward to, though, is a huge orders of magnitude increase in the amount of U.S. aid or investment. The amount of aid is significant. It hasn't largely decreased under Donald Trump, despite his rhetoric. It's not likely to grow by vast leaps and bounds under Joe Biden's presidency, right, because the budget is already under stress from all kinds of things.
All right, I want to get a final comment from you all. And Dr. John Gong in Beijing, let me start off with you. What lessons are there for the world? What are we going to look forward to post the U.S. electoral process?
I think the overall message, the overall lesson we have learned is that, this kind of unilateralism, this kind of American first policy is not going to be sustainable, even for America's own interest. And thankfully, the American people have spoken and they have voted him out. And this incoming new president have said that he's going to come back to unilateralism. He's going to join the Paris Accord and join the WHO. Now we have to keep in mind that the biggest victim of America's withdrawal from the WHO is African countries. I mean, they are suffering most from the fundings of these programs that are having positive impact on Africa. And hopefully, these things can be restored. I think in terms of what can Africa learn from America, I think we need to keep in mind that democracy is down to details. Democracy is something that has to be worked out, has to be done in a sort of a gentleman's fashion.
Right.
With Trump in power, he is resorting to these all kinds of nasty political gimmicks to trying to steal an election, and that's not going to work. That's not going to resonate with most of the people in the world.
Emira Woods, your thoughts?
Oh, I think the biggest lesson for the world is the power of movements. If we see what really made the difference in these U.S. elections is movements. It's movements like Black Lives Matter that touched people's hearts and not only in the U.S. but globally, and put issues of equity on the ballot, on the agenda. So I think it's the power of movements that will continue to weigh in heavily. I think the other issue is around equity and particularly now with the global economy in crisis, people are demanding equity and justice. And I think that's a lesson from this election and will be a lesson going forward. The third, I think, is around media and the press. I think there was an outright assault on the press over the last 4 years. And so I think it's a recognition that democracy is not just voting, but it's also protecting all of the instruments that help to bring up citizenry. And so, I think the lesson is also that we must protect the instruments, all of the instruments of democracy, particularly a free press, to make sure that the citizens are informed, are able to freely elect their leaders, right, and then to hold them accountable.
Ambassador Haggag, you have the final word.
I think our leaders should do more in courting the United States. The United States is a big continent. Not everything is done and decided in Washington. So I hope when one of our heads of state visits Washington, he will go to some other states in order to introduce not only Africa, but even his own country. And some states in the United States are conducting their own individual foreign policy. California and Texas, they send delegations to talk directly to African countries for bilateral trade and bilateral cultural affairs. So we hope that we should also speak to important think tanks in the United States. They do affect a lot of the administration policy, and our think tanks should be in constant contact with those think tanks in the United States.
And on that note, we'll leave it there for the moment. That's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts from Washington, D.C. via Zoom. Emira Woods, Associate Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. In Beijing, Dr. John Gong, Professor of Economics at the University of International Business and Economics. In Johannesburg, Brooks Spector, Associate Editor of the Daily Maverick and a former U.S. diplomat. And in Cairo, Ambassador Ahmed Haggag, Secretary General of the Africa Society. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more on Talk Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Until next time, goodbye.